Hi there, my name is Robbie Russell. I'm the VP of Engineering and the founding partner at Planet Argon. We're a Ruby on Rails software development agency based out of Portland, Oregon in the United States. What I'd like to do is walk you through some of the information we got out of this year's 2018 Ruby on Rails developer community survey. First, a little bit of backstory. So back in 2009, we ran our first survey of the Ruby on Rails community. Part of our business back then was actually hosting, we actually owned a number of bare metal servers and we're running them out of a co-location here in Portland, Oregon. And we were seeing this kind of trend towards, or at least what we thought was a trend, into maybe using cloud computing and services like Heroku. And we weren't convinced that this was a business model we wanted to continue pursuing, so we ran a survey of the community to get a sense of what people were preferring, where they were moving, and use that data to then help us decide that it was part of a business that we were going to sell, so that way we could just focus on what bulk of what our business was doing, which is actually writing, design and development of Ruby on Rails applications. And so every few years since then, we've kind of evolved the survey to start including more information about what versions of tools they're using, what third-party systems they're integrating with, how long they've been working with Rails, get a better feel for how the whole Rails developer community is. And so it's kind of evolved a little bit since the first year we ran it, and this has been able to give us some numbers to see how some trends have happened over the years, the last 9 years now. And so this year, 2018, we had over 2,000 developers participate in the month of March when we ran the survey from 72 countries, which is great. I think our last numbers were somewhere around 1,500, and so we had an increase of from 1,500 to 2,000 developers participate this time, which was great. So let's talk a little bit through some of the some interesting things we kind of observed, and we'll also share a couple links at the end that you can go on and learn more about it and see all of the results, because we've always provided that information out to the public so that developers can kind of draw their own conclusions and make some assumptions about where the future of the Rails community is going. So this one was quite interesting. So one question we were curious about was how developers learned to start writing software, and approximately 50% of the developers that responded said that they taught themselves, whereas only 1 out of 3 actually had a formal education. Fun fact, I myself dropped out of high school when I was halfway through my junior year, do not have a computer science degree either. How long have folks been working with Rails? So let's see, we were seeing that about 50% of the developers that responded indicated that they've been working with Ruby on Rails now for over 7 years, which is pretty awesome. I think I've been using it now for, it's been a little over 13 years. So 75% of all the developers that responded said over 4 years. So that means we have a lot of mid and senior level developers in the community, which is great. There's a question that we keep hearing about in the kind of just the ether of the internet, is that there's rumors that Rails is being used by less new developers, so or developers are not starting to use Rails for their projects as often. So we wanted to kind of see what the numbers look like, and so we're actually seeing there's a little bit of accuracy to that. So like we can see this last year, 3% of developers indicated that they've been working with Rails for a little under a year, whereas in 2016 that number was 4%. Back in 2014 that was 6%. Back in 2012 that was 11, in 2009 that was 13. So there has been a downward trend, but on the flip side we're also seeing that folks are sticking around longer with Rails too. So if anything, I don't know that it would say that Rails momentum has died. There might be some truth to that, and we'll talk on a couple other data points in a moment, but it seems maybe if the Rails kind of adoption for new applications has seemingly plateaued quite a bit. And I think another way to look at it is like the Rails has matured and folks are sticking around for a long time. And from on the flip side, that 7+ year number from 2016 to 2018 jumped from 38 to 50%. So folks are kind of like digging their heels in a little bit there, but maybe if you're building a new application, you have a lot more to choose from in terms of like which frameworks you might be using. We also wanted to find out how large development teams are in the community, and so we're seeing that nearly 50% of the teams are somewhere in the range of 2 to 8 developers, with about 20 developers are working by themselves. So that's in and of itself, 70% of the community is under 8, but kind of we're seeing a lot of like 2 to 4 people size teams, and that's kind of on par with what we've seen from some of our clients that we work with, where there's kind of a theme around like building out pods of teams where you have 3 or 4 developers working on your project, and then you kind of break those teams up into 3 to 4 development kind of squads, and then they're working on different pieces. Like you might have an API development team, and then you've got another team that's working on the React side of things or what have you. So there seems to be a little bit of consistency there. So and there's of course some companies have way larger teams as well. But and then when it comes to test coverage, I want to believe this is true. I have a little bit of skepticism that everybody was being super accurate, but 50% of the developers that responded indicated that they had at least 80% test coverage in terms of like lines of code and how much of their application they're covering, which is great. So if that's true, that's great. What's interesting is we take over a lot of Ruby on Rails applications, and we continue to work on them, and that's not always the case. We're quite often it's not uncommon to see trends of or see a lot of patterns where small teams or developers of one kind of falls off the testing bandwagon after a few years. It's not uncommon for us to inherit a project where the spec or test directory hasn't been touched in 2 years, yet there's been code added. So I think it kind of depends on the team, but I'm glad to see that folks are claiming to write tests, and so that's great. And then 40%, nearly half of the developers are using RSpec, which is awesome. And I think the thing that digging down a little bit deeper into the information is like the default test unit that DHH would advocate using for development. Only 7% of responders said that they were using that, so that's quite a big delta there. And then we also saw 25% of developers that identify that they're using Capybara for integration testing, and that's what we use as well as RSpec. Fun fact, RSpec was first developed, or started getting developed on back in 2006 on a train ride from Portland, Oregon to Chicago for RailsConf 2006 by a couple developers, and they were working on RSpec on a train trip that Planet Argon organized called the Argon Express. Shortly after, we became one of the agencies to definitely jump all in on RSpec and have been since then. So with everybody writing tests, and that's awesome, we wanted to get a feel for what people were using for continuous integration, so that if you're not familiar with continuous integrations, when you write your test and you push up your code into your Git repository or wherever you're hosting your code base, you might have a third-party system that will then pull down the code and then run your test suite so that you can kind of get a backup check on that your build's still working. And so, or I say build like it's, but anyways, that your test suite's still passing, and then notify your team. So 21% of developers that responded said that they were using Circle CI, or 17% and 15% by Jenkins and Travis. And I thought an amusing aspect was Planet Argon apparently is in the 1% because we're using Solano Labs tool for CI, which used to be called TDM, and I didn't realize it was used by so few people, but we have been migrating into the 2% range of using Bitbucket pipelines, because that's been a great little addition on top of Bitbucket, which is where we store most of our client code repositories. So kind of interesting there. But anyways, I thought I would share that. And this one is a fun one. So I've been using and loving Postgres for longer than Ruby on Rails has even existed. I started developing with Postgres probably about 4 years prior to, so probably around 2001 were some of my first projects with Postgres, maybe 2000. And when I started to develop with Ruby on Rails, I was using Postgres on my projects and would find bugs early on, and then ended up being my first open source contribution to the Ruby on Rails framework, were actually like bug fixes that were related to Postgres, or adding some features to help make Postgres work a little bit better with the project. And then there was also some software tools like Typo, which was developed by Tobias at Shopify. It was a Ruby on Rails based blogging engine. My first contribution to that project was actually a Postgres version of the database schema, because we didn't have database migrations in there. But anyhow, while I was a big proponent of Postgres, MySQL was definitely favored by the majority of the Rails core team and the community, and it was very obvious. So you can find a couple of old podcasts and blog posts by me where I'm touting Postgres, but I never really expected it to become mainstream. In 2009, MySQL was, as we see, preferred by 67.5, a little less than 67% of the community, whereas in 2012, Postgres and MySQL kind of swapped places, and that was kind of a very drastic shift. And it wasn't because all of a sudden like the Rails core team came out and said, "Yay, Postgres." It was actually because of, I think, open source licensing. So you may or may not know this, but Postgres and MySQL have different open source licenses. So MySQL is under GPL, very similar to Linux, and actually exactly the same license as Linux. And Postgres is released under its own license, which is very similar to BSD and MIT, which is what Ruby on Rails is released under. And so when Heroku and Amazon were starting to bundle in, it needed to bundle in a database into their platform, the obvious choice was to use Postgres because they weren't required to open source their whole stack along the in the same way that they would have if they had released that under with MySQL. So, and then also since then, Oracle buying MySQL probably didn't do MySQL any favors either, because it kind of, Oracle is the big bad wolf, and so goes the community. So to see that now 85% of Ruby on Rails developers that responded to this question said that they prefer Postgres now was just like this huge, amazing shift in the ecosystem, and I'm kind of quite excited about that number. And with that, we're now going to switch over and talk a little bit about Ruby on Rails versions. So just a couple weeks ago, Rails 5.2 was officially released, and as I'm recording this, RailsConf 2018 is going on, and we're kind of tying up the release of this at the same time. But anyhow, the thing that was interesting is just they got to get a feel for what versions of Ruby on Rails developers are working with. And so it wasn't like everybody that responded to this had to only pick one, so they identified all the different versions that they are currently supporting. And so we can see that there's still a number of people that are working on projects below 4.2, which means that they are no longer getting security patches from the Rails core team, and they should probably upgrade those projects in the near future. But let's assume that Rails 4.2 is probably on the chopping block this next year, if not sooner. And so if you're a Ruby on Rails developer or someone that owns a Ruby on Rails application as part of one of their assets in their business, you probably want to get that addressed in the near future. And I'm glad to see that there's still people are keeping up. We're seeing 22% for 5.1 and 5.2, which means in the last year versions. That's great to see. But let's get those projects upgraded. Another thing that was interesting was just to get a sense of, and we see that 50% of developers that responded said that they are using containerization for their projects, whether in development or production. And I wish we had asked a question to distinguish between the two, but we'll take it for what it is, and it could be either and or both. And of those folks, 75% of them said they're using Docker, while almost 20% of them are using Kubernetes. And we're starting to use Docker more and more in our projects as well. Another great thing is that folks are adhering to conventions and are using RUBOCOP. So nearly 50% of all responses said that they're using RUBOCOP to hold themselves to their style guides and such, and that's great. I hope to see this number jump to 75 in the next 2 years. So let's get out there and install RUBOCOP on our projects. That's great. This one I was really excited about. So if you are for active jobs, so if you're running background jobs in your project, for a long time everybody's using delayed job. We still use that on a number of projects, but this one is really great because we're seeing that 50% of the developers that responded said they're using Sidekick, and Sidekick is developed by Mike Perham, which I know personally, and he's been able to make a living out of writing open source software and having commercial license and support offerings as well to go along with that product. And so I think this is just a great success story, and kudos to you, Mike. And if you're not using Sidekick, you might give it a go. And just a few fun slides to kind of touch on. So we asked developers which gems they love the most, and so Devise and Sidekick and Pry and RSpec and RuboCop all popped up, and you can see some other things in the kind of cloud and the word cloud down behind that. Grape and Awesome Print and Virtus and Flipper and Spree and Cloudinary and Brakeman. A lot of great tools out there. So make sure you thank those open source contributors, the folks that wrote those projects. Most frustrating gems, and I can attest to this, when Nokogiri was identified as the most frustrating gem of everybody that responded. And so I can't count how many times I've burned hours just trying to deal with dependencies in Nokogiri. So I hear you there. Devise shows up again, so it's not only is one of the most loved gems, it's also one of the most frustrating gems. And our spec shows up again, and active admin, which we can attest to on a couple of projects that we've worked on over the years, it has been a problem, but I'm glad to see that the community is keeping that up to date. But this one actually really surprised me, is active record being one of the most frustrating gems. And it just, why are people fighting like what makes Rails so great? And so with active record is like one of the most amazing things that really enticed me to the Ruby on Rails community originally, and I have to thank Martin Fowler for outlining that pattern for DHH, for implementing that in Ruby at the time. So thank you, DHH, for active record, despite so many people thinking it's frustrating. So some closing thoughts. So when we were planning this survey, the big question that we were trying to answer is Ruby on Rails dead? Because we keep seeing these posts on the internet. Rails is dead. It's not gaining momentum anymore. And admittedly, we were hoping to see something that would indicate one way or another. And while we saw an uptick in how many responses there were in the survey, we didn't really see any major indicators that the technology stack is dying. Rather, it seems moderately flat, which could be seen as a bad thing. And we know anecdotally that there are a lot of great technology stacks out there for folks to choose from if they're going to start building a new web application with. All these JavaScript frameworks now, and we're seeing a lot of tools. If you look in the data a little bit further, you'll see that there's like React is like heavily favored in the community, and so we're seeing like Rails becoming an API platform, and React being built for like front ends and other mobile devices and things like that. So I think what this says to me is that Rails needs to find new ways to engage the wider community and invite them in. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the community. Is like we do need to not just work with it and continue building and making it better, but we need to make it accessible and give people a good story for why it's a good tool. I like an honest story, but a good story on why Ruby on Rails is still a great choice if you're going to be building on a new application. And if you're curious to learn more, we'd love you to check out our blog. We're writing a few more articles about our findings on other topics that came out of here. I just wanted to touch on a few of them here. But thanks for listening, and hope to see you again in 2020. If you need help with your existing Ruby on Rails application, from upgrades to ongoing support and maintenance, get in touch with us at planetargon.com. Thanks again. My name is Robbie Russell, VP of Engineering and founder of Planet Argon. Cheers. Have a great day.